before I start the talk this morning, I wanted to talk a little bit about a trip that I was just on. I took a trip down to San Francisco and to Los Angeles, and I was in San Francisco to help with the installation of a new abbot in the temple there called Sokoji, which is also celebrating its 90th anniversary. And then traveled to Los Angeles. Did I say San Francisco? Mm-hmm. I said, okay, good. Then traveled to Los Angeles for an annual meeting that we have for our denomination, the Soto denomination's branch in North America. And we have about, I think currently is maybe 60 or 65 teachers who are officially recognized as international disseminators of the Dharma, who some portion of gather together once a year for some business type meetings, and then also to hear some lectures from a teacher that's usually comes from Japan. And the reason that I felt like bringing that up this morning is every time I visit Sokoji and Zenshuji, those two temples, Zenshuji just celebrated its 100th anniversary 2 years ago. It just reminds me how indebted we are to our Japanese American forebears who brought this version of the Dharma, this lineage of the Dharma, to North America. And really for the first 50 years or more, the Zen Dharma of North America existed within those communities. And there were very few people outside of those communities that were involved. And then later, in the late 50s, early 60s, particularly counterculture people, inspired by the likes of people like Alan Watts, started to visit those temples. And what we tend to run into in North America now, if we're going to go learn Soto Zen somewhere, is not a Japanese American temple, but a Zen center or another kind of temple that isn't located within a Japanese American community. For some years, there's been some kind of rift there, and particularly with the mentality of domination, which seems just completely endemic to white American culture, colonial type culture. There was a lot of looking down on the practices of the immigrant communities and a kind of valorization of what the people who had come in later were doing. I am happy to report some balance is returning to that environment. That's why I talk about it when I go visit and come back in these sort of ways, is because I want to promote that kind of balance, not to shame non-Japanese American congregations for having done something wrong, but just to bring our awareness forward that really there's a deep indebtedness to these congregations and to these temples which have cultivated the flame for so many years. And at Sokoji in particular, it was there for the installation of a new abbot. His name is Koshi Kurotaki. He was here for the abbot installation a few years ago. He played the drums, if any of you had the good fortune to talk with him. He's quite a spirited fellow. And he's been there for about 10 years as the resident priest, and now it became time for him to be officially installed as the abbot. So when that happens, one of the things that is part of that process is the new abbot will appoint a head monk, which is referred to as the shuso. And that head monk will do a lot of work to take care of the practice at the temple for a period of time. And then they'll be tested in a ceremony, which many of you have experienced here, called Dharma combat. And in the Dharma combat, isn't that kind of a provocative terminology? Dharma combat. So basically asking tough questions. Everyone's trying to knock the head student off their seat a little bit. Ask them something hard. See how they respond. And if you're not quite satisfied, or you think there might be a weak point in their answer, you poke in there a little bit more, and you try to have this sharpen your understanding through a kind of vigorous exchange. So that Dharma combat ceremony, the shuso for that Dharma combat ceremony is a very long-term practitioner of San Francisco Zen Center. actually was the president of San Francisco Zen Center for many years. Wonderful priest named Sozan. And he was the Shuso at Sokoji. San Francisco Zen Center was established by a teacher named Shunryu Suzuki, who was the abbot of Sokoji in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And he left Sokoji to establish San Francisco Zen Center with a certain amount of hard feelings on all sides over time. So now, one of the San Francisco Zen Center long-term priests at this very important place became the head student there. So this kind of circle that happened, and there were maybe 30 or 35 priests who came from San Francisco Zen Center to participate in the ceremonies there, along with many of us who had gathered from other places. And so this kind of circle emerging, which is very hopeful to me. If you're interested in more about that kind of Japanese American roots of this tradition, we have a book that's in our little store in the front room called American Sutra, which particularly talks about the experience of Japanese American Buddhists during World War II and internment, and how they cultivated the Dharma through that time and what it is that they faced. Really inspiring. We are so darn heady, you know. I mean, by we, I mean like the non-Japanese American groups. And in this, you'll read about a priest who, they were in internment, and he didn't know what to do to help people. And so he just picked up stones, and he would write the character from a sutra, from a Buddhist teaching on the stone. And then he'll walk around and he'll drop them on the ground, because you're not supposed to be passing these things out, right? And he would just pass them on the ground. And then other people who were internment, as they were walking, they would see one of these stones and they would pick it up and they would take it home and they'd put it on a little altar they had made in their barracks, you know, so to speak. And many of these kind of interesting, collecting a little bit of money from all the households, although people had almost nothing, really like almost nothing, and to buy the concrete to build a stupa, to celebrate and to honor, really not celebrate, but to honor all the people who had passed away in the first year of internment, which was huge. Anybody who was frail really took a very big beating there. And they had the first Obon dance, which is one of the most important ways of honoring the dead in Japanese society. And they circumambulated that stupa and sang the proper songs and read the proper sutras, etc. So anyway, it's a wonderful book. If you're interested in that kind of thing, I'll send you in that direction. Okay, but that's not what I'm going to talk about this one. Next week, we have a very important practice, which we do at this temple. It's really a central type of practice at this temple. And next week is the large ceremony, which is the very most visible component of a practice that we're doing all the time. And we refer to it as osegaki. Sometimes you'll hear it as sejikie. Osegaki means offerings to the hungry ghosts. Sejikie means food offerings. And in that ritual, which, since you'll all be here next week, you'll get to experience, is very colorful, and a lot of things are happening in that ritual. And it's kind of pretty vibrant. That ritual's happening all throughout the month of October in a kind of special way. That's our practice here at Buddha Eye Temple. But then it also is part of our practice every day in the evening service throughout the year. And so the reason I say that again and again is I'm trying to build people's way of thinking about this is kind of being concentric circles. There's something that you experience, which is there is, come to the temple on the Sunday that's closest to Halloween, and you're going to experience this ritual, and it's profound and impactful. Right? But that exists within a whole constant practice of what is presented in the ritual practice of Segaki. Myth, legend, teaches us about things in a little bit different way than explanation. And I've been saying that a lot through the past couple months. And cosmology also does. Cosmology in this case being just what is the basic framework of how it is that you think the universe is constructed, or where are we in this whole big matrix of existence. Right? And Buddhism has a very fundamental cosmology, which says there's 6 different regions or 6 different places in which beings might be reborn. And one of them is the human realm. That's where you probably all are, although some of you might be foxes or devious spirits who are showing up in human form. That's completely possible and very common in the stories of the ancestors. But our realm is the human realm. What Buddhism tells us, or this kind of fundamental cosmology, tells us that there are many layers to existence. Human existence is one of those layers. But some of the other layers are like the layer of the divine beings. Another layer are the layers of divine beings that have fallen out of their kind of favored status, and they're upset about that. They're known as as angry spirits. Okay? There's also hell realms, animal realms, and then this realm of the hungry ghosts. And the realm of the hungry ghosts and the human realm are very, very close together. Now, when we talk about cosmology or myth or legend, oftentimes it can be kind of difficult for people to figure out, am I supposed to believe this is true? Am I supposed to believe there are these beings called hungry ghosts? And I'll give you the very short answer. Yes. With asterisks. There's all kinds of ways to think about what does it mean for these beings to exist. One way is to think of them as being kind of like externalized objects of your mind, like they would exist in some measurable Ghostbusters sort of way, right? Like you have a special tool that would be able to detect the plasma and know that those spirits were there or not. Okay, so do they exist in that way? Maybe. For me personally, I kind of think there are some things on that end which we try not to pay attention to, but probably if we did, we would recognize a lot more than we normally do. But I don't pay much I don't spend a lot of time there because I don't think it's really where the most import is. It's not where the deeper message is necessarily going to come through. The quality of these beings are not just something located outside of us, but they also, we could talk about them in psychological ways. We could talk about them in spiritual ways, which means that they're not so much located in discursive thought or explanation or scientific measurement, but that they are forces, they are indeed beings that influence our life, and we can't grasp them. We don't have a way to grasp them. Now, by the way, we don't really have a way to grasp anything, right? But we pretend like we can grasp a lot of things, like say an apple, like these beautiful apples, which I think Togen and Yuton went to pick a couple days ago out at a Buddhist teacher named Seido Martin, who has a farm outside of town. They went to pick them there. So you see an apple and you go, oh, I know what that is, an apple. How foolish is that? To think you could know what an apple is. You could have markers of an apple and you could say, well, I can identify it as an apple. It's probably nice to know the difference between an apple and a poison berry or some different things like that. So in that sense, we could say that I know it, I know what it is, I know how to relate with it in a certain sense. But that's very different than being able to grasp it. Being able to say, I know all the edges of what this apple is. This is where legend, cosmology, myth, leads us into another possibility where we realize I can't really hold everything and say exactly what it is. Now here's a story which invites me into another kind of relationship with reality, right? Which isn't only that graspable side of reality, but the part that I can't grasp. In that sense, the mystery of the apple now becomes a whole fairy tale about sleeping beauties and witches, and all kinds of possibilities. So in this story, that's at the heart of Seigaki, is a kind of simple story, but is a story of one of the closest disciples of the Buddha, Ananda. And so it's said, it's good to know about who Ananda was. Ananda was not just someone who practiced with the Buddha in the large congregation of renunciates that lived and practiced close to the Buddha Shakyamuni, but Ananda was his attendant. for decades. And so he was right there with the Buddha all the time. He was there to see that the Buddha had everything it is that he needed. He was attending to him constantly. So they had this kind of deep intimacy. He was really seen as one of the foremost of the assembly, and eventually becomes the second ancestor. The first ancestor is Mahakashapa, and the second ancestor is Ananda. So Mahakashapa takes over for the Buddha after the Buddha passes into final nirvana, and Ananda is the next after that. So he's very close to the Buddha. It's also maybe important to know that Ananda is famous for being the reciter of the teachings. So oftentimes you'll hear those words. His title will be Ananda, reciter of the teachings. Ananda had a memory in which he could remember every word the Buddha had ever spoken. Okay? This is one of those places where you go, oh, legend, how nice, how could I think about it psychologically? And then I said, sometimes that stuff on the edge that could be measurable, sometimes is really real. There are people like this, right? And actually it's a bit of a curse, it seems to be. But if you lived with a Buddha, maybe not as much. So Ananda was there, and he later on, after the Buddha's death, he recalled all of the sermons to the congregation of arhats who could then determine what would become, how it is that they would move these teachings forward. So Ananda's no slouch, and he's there with the assembly, receiving teachings from the Buddha, and then after the Buddha's teachings, one evening he goes off by himself, and he's spending some time quietly meditating, probably thinking about what the Buddha had taught, and he's visited by this being, which I usually refer to as Blazing Mouth. The Japanese pronunciation of his name is Enku. So this Enku is the king of the hungry ghosts, and he appears before the Buddha, before Ananda, and he says, Ananda, in 3 days you will die, and you will fall into my realm of the hungry ghosts. And Ananda's startled. Enku's a wild-looking being, crazy hair, and eyes spinning, fire coming out of his mouth, pencil-thin neck and bloated belly, covered in dirt and excrement. And Ananda says, why? And Enku says, it's your karma. In Buddhism, karma doesn't just mean like your sin or some bad thing that you did. Karma means the whole setup of the arc of your living, the way you're living, which is conditioned by all of these previous lives, the way you've lived in all of those previous lives. And although Ananda was really a kind of saint, there was something there in his life. There was something there in his stream of being, which was going to lead him to this realm of the hungry ghosts. And so he said, is there not some way out of it? And Enku said, no, it's your karma. And he said, are you sure there must be some way? And Enku says, yes, there's one way, but it's really impossible. You have to satiate my hunger. And the very definition of these beings, these hungry ghosts, is that their hunger cannot be satiated. Even when they're surrounded by nourishment, when they take something, an apple, and they put it in their mouth, it turns into pus or blood or fire. Their necks are so thin that it can't go down. In that traditional cosmology or iconography of the hungry ghosts, it's said that they believe that the nourishment is outside of them. They believe it's separate. They think they should be able to measure it, grasp it, say exactly what it is. And that's the reason it can't be nourishment for them. That's why it turns into something else, right? Because they don't know how to just receive without grasping. So to satiate the hunger of such a being is impossible, but Enku doesn't stop there. He says, and you don't only have to satiate my hunger, you have to satiate the hunger of all of the horde of hungry ghosts, which are a larger number than the number of grains of sand on the banks of the Ganges River, which is a massive river. He said, you have to satisfy all of us. And that's not even everything. You also have to feed all of the spirits of the worlds. And you have to feed all of the divine beings. And you have to feed all of the sages, all of the great seers. They also all must be fed. And furthermore, the three treasures of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So a very big task. Basically, he's identifying all manner of beings, all type of beings who could be beings in any way that we could call beings. All of them must be satisfied. That's the only thing that would satiate the hungry ghost. That's the only thing that would get him past his karma. This is a very interesting thing to think about. Now, mythology is helping us see in a different way. It's not just giving us a story, it's helping us orient in a different way. What is nourishment? What is it to be satisfied? What is it to live through satisfaction as opposed to living through deficit? This is part of what's being taught in this part of the story. So Enku disappears and Ananda goes to the Buddha. And it's said that he falls to the ground in prostration before the Buddha and is weeping. And he tells the Buddha what has happened. And the Buddha says, "Don't worry, Ananda. I have learned a method. This is not actually impossible." I don't know about you, but the things which I don't know how to go past, the kind of hungers and grasping and meanness, which I know is in there if I pay attention, I really don't know what to do with it. I don't know. I feel at the end of my rope. And I feel like I have to get to the end of my rope. It's not like there's nothing to do about it. One thing is, I try not to give it the reins. And Ananda was pretty good at that. Ananda had really learned how to not just give the reins to the hungry ghosts, but he had not yet learned how to feed them. He had not yet learned about this nourishment. And so he needs something else. This is part of our practice too. Yeah, don't just let your hungry ghosts reign wild. That's not the message, right? The message is, yeah, learn to not give them the reins. But that's very different than learning how to nourish them. Or learning how to overcome what's at the basis of the hungry ghost's karma. So the Buddha continues to teach, or moves on to teach Ananda this way, this method, which he says he learned from the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, or we could say the Bodhisattva of love, when the Buddha was living in the heaven of complete contentment before being born into this world. Avalokitesvara, this is the Bodhisattva that is personified oftentimes with 1,000 arms, like the icon that's to the Buddha's right on our altar. That this Bodhisattva is a Bodhisattva that doesn't buy into the separating idea of subject and object. And that's why this Bodhisattva has an infinite number of hands, because everything can be touched. Everything is touching. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Everything is touching. It's not like it's over there, I'm over here. There's no such thing as over there, right? And Avalokitesvara understands that so completely that you can just feel Avalokitesvara's hand is right here on your body. It's touching you. And so this Bodhisattva knows about nourishment and taught this method to the Buddha. So the Buddha then shares it with Ananda. This is a very important point. The Buddha and Ananda do not just enact this ritual, the two of them. They wait till the next day when the Sangha was gathering, when the community was gathering, and they call everyone together to make these offerings in this special way, which the Buddha had learned from Avalokitesvara. And then, in the ritual, the first thing they do is they call together all the beings that are not embodied in that circle of people who have gathered together. So all possible manner of beings, including all of those hungry ghosts. Next week before the ritual, I'll tell you a little bit about how that shows up in the ritual that we're doing. There's like the ghost house. Those of you who've been to that ritual before, there's that loaf of bread with a stick in the middle and the 5 color paper that's coming down from it. That's the ghost house. So those 5 colors help to collect all of the hungry ghosts and show them where the bread is. In East Asia, it's usually rice, or is always rice. But here we use bread. So it's directing them to that place. So that's an example. There's many things like that are happening in the ritual. But this point that there's all these layers of being that are there. Really, everyone has to be participating in the nourishment, or else there's no way that those hungry ghosts could be fed. That's the kind of teaching. So they enacted these offerings, and Ananda did not fall into the realm of the hungry ghosts. And from that time in Buddhist communities, through all different kinds of lineages, these offerings to hungry ghosts are made. And they're slightly different in all of the different traditions. Again, in our temple here, on a daily basis, we make those offerings in a kind of very simple way. In October, throughout the month of October, we make them in a kind of more grandiose way. And then we have them this one particular day that commemorates that day of Ananda and the Buddha and the community making those offerings together. So the last talk I gave, which was not so different than this talk, but I had asked people what they thought the meaning was. Like what were they understanding, or what was it teaching us? And we had a discussion about that a little bit, and a lot of interesting insight from the assembly about how we might think about the story. And I really want to encourage you to do that, to live with the story. You hear it for the first time, it's like, okay, I can't remember who's this person, who is that person, so it takes a while for the story to get into you, but as you may have noticed, I tell the story over and over and over and over again. No eye rolling yet, I appreciate that. But as you hear the story, there's this simple structure to it. Oftentimes mythology is like this. There's a simple structure to a story where the details might change sometimes, but there's a reason for that. The simple structure of it, once it starts getting into your consciousness, once it's in there, it's a kind of something that's moving, your own imagination starts to accept it. And as your own imagination accepts it, your own imagination also uses that as a way to understand things, a way to see things, right? So it's not just a story. When the story is very, very detailed, then you get caught up in the details of the story, which is okay. Oftentimes that will still come into your imagination and you use it in some way. But mythology has this kind of quality where it's just, okay, here are the highlights. Okay? So you don't have to remember everything, but let it get in there, and as your own imagination is accepting it, it will start working with it. And the point I was making about that in the last talk was, there's a kind of more discursive type teaching that might happen where we're like, oh, now I see how Ananda was, although he was this like Arhat, he was this incredible person within the assembly of deep, deep practice. There's this facet that he didn't yet know how to work. He didn't yet know how to work with. And you could start thinking, what was that part he didn't know how to, what in me is the part that he didn't know how to work with? So that's more like the story, like seeing into the story. And I was saying this other thing that might happen is some weird stuff just might happen. And you might not know what that weird stuff is, but then that will start teaching you. And I shared about a dream I had. It was very, I'll tell it in a very short version, where I had this dream. It was a couple weeks into this practice that we have in October. And in this dream, I was with the student and I was taking them to this person who was going to teach them something. And this person who was going to teach them something was a very old woman, and she had a lot of purple on. And when I took the student there to get taught, she didn't want to teach him. She wanted to teach me. And she said, Ejo, you're being too narrow-minded. You're being too strict. she didn't quite use these words, but the way I've started to feel it is, you're too mean. Mean in that classic sense of like holding things tight. And then she took this purple like velvet top hat and she put it on my head. Yeah. But when I woke up from that dream, I was kind of in bed and my eyes opened and I felt this softening in my chest that was, it lasted for a few hours, and it was a kind of important collapsing of something. I don't know exactly what it was, but the gentleness which was present in that time was really palpable. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is, first I want to encourage you to pay attention to those kinds of things. They will occur in your life in some way or other. I think they're occurring for us all the time, but mostly we don't care for them enough to know how to integrate them into our spiritual life. And this one is pretty memorable. And then when a person talks about it, you think like, oh, well, that sounds pretty cool. I mean, the purple hat wasn't that cool. It was weird, but it wasn't. It's just like, I think the reason I can tell the story the way I do is because I was paying attention to it, right? And what was happening in my imagination and acceptance of this mythology or other mythology that allowed that to emerge, I don't really know. I don't need to know. I don't need to grasp it. I just need to appreciate it. And then that appreciation, we can learn something in a slightly different way than what is kind of explainable, right? Like, oh yeah, Nanda's like this, and you can see in the story that the mythology is telling us this or telling us that. Yeah. This becomes a different kind of an exploration. So at that time, I asked people to pay attention to that. I'm just curious, is anything walloped anybody that they're willing to share?
This is a little complicated.
Yeah.
So thinking about the hungry ghost in all of us.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the desire, the longing, whatever all it is, to awaken my practitioners, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes in the early, before I was with you, previously we talked more about gaining mind.
Yeah.
And you can't effort and you can't not effort. So is any part of gaining mind our desire? So where does that become the hungry ghost functioning?
Yeah.
And where is that? I mean, I don't know how there's a clean line between that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is why this story, this practice is so important. And it's why Ananda is so important. Ananda is like, I don't know technically if he's an arhat by this time, but he's like about as good as it gets. Right? And not only is it good as it gets in the sense of his practice, his kindness, he's known for being deeply kind, but also his proximity to the Buddha. He's got it all, basically. Right? He's also the Buddha's cousin. So it's all like right, like this. And so one of the reasons, one of the ways this story really teaches me is that even in that most exalted type position, there's this question. What's the division between Ananda and insatiable appetite? And almost every story we see, we only see the shininess of this great teacher. We see the Buddha, we only see the Buddha's completeness. It's very hard for us to see the shadow. Really, for the Buddha, there is no shadow, but for all of his followers, there is. Or maybe we're his shadow. Right? And so we can see in Ananda, even though in that situation of this, like sort of unimaginable achievement, spiritual achievement, there's this question of, okay, is he leaving behind the hungry ghosts? Is the realm of the hungry ghost going to be just left to its own devices? Are all those beings just left behind because Ananda's great? Is that what we're talking about? Is that the world we want to live in? Is that the worlds we want to live in? I don't. I don't believe that for a second. That path does not resonate for me at all. Why would I go there if there are beings who can't? Now, it doesn't mean that I'm going to know how to help everybody, or that I should put myself into a really cruddy situation purposefully. That doesn't resonate with me either. But is there this break between the two? And to me, Ananda is such a hero in this story, because Ananda is the only one Enku appears to. Right? And so that's a great like expression of Mahayana, great expression of the great vehicle, of the spirit of the Bodhisattva. So Ananda at that point becomes this kind of great Bodhisattva, not only concerned with his own, spiritual salvation, but all of these beings. At the same time, if he's like, oh, well, my own spiritual salvation is not important, I'm just going to work for these other beings, that isn't going to work. He's got to find a method which is beyond like focusing on the other or focusing on the self. And that's what this kind of nourishment that we're studying is about.
Well, Justin?
Mm-hmm.
I have a difficult thing that I've been holding for quite a while, because I come from being a cook.
Mm-hmm.
I have like a Tenzo heart. I've cooked for many different Dharma groups, many different people, and I have this desire, and I think I have this desire. I want to be able to nourish everyone.
Yeah.
I want to be able to suit everyone's desires, and it's really that's on some level it's completely impossible, because some people have a sweet tooth, some people are diabetic, some people need meat to get their protein, some people are vegan, and some people need spicy, some people can't do it, and so it's impossible, and it's been really, really hard for me over the years to have peace with that, and I can see the ways that dilemma that I hold is very similar to Ananda having this impossible task of nourishing everyone, but it's not landing, like I don't get it.
So one of the things that exists in a traditional monastic training place, which is very difficult to emulate as the institution is smaller, is the separation between the storehouse and the cooks. The reason that happened, the division happened, because originally the renunciate followers of the Buddha, they weren't monastics, they were mendicants. The difference between a monastic and a mendicant is a monastic lives in a monastic community, usually in the case of Buddhism, generally are, or really have always been, home leavers, so don't have family, are celibate, live not in a vow of poverty, that's Christian, but live without material possessions. This is a little different. Live without material possessions. Just a few things. And then you just travel from place to place and you receive whatever food people give you, and you have to live on that. So people with like dietary restrictions, that was pretty hard on, because there was no dietary restrictions. In fact, the Buddha is reported to have died from eating tainted food. So that culture then comes into the monastic culture, and this very smart thing was done, which I didn't notice for a really long time. And the person who was in charge of storing the food, and because they started to have money in the monastic institutions where the mendicants didn't, they could purchase food. The storehouse and the cook are very separate. So when you read like in the instructions to the cook for Dogen Zenji, go and read that part where he talks about what it means to go and receive the food from the storehouse manager. Right? So what happens is, the reason that's so important is you have to receive the food from the storehouse manager and then cook it into whatever you can in the best way possible. This is an expression of the limitation of the material that we might possibly be able to have to cook the food. But what happens is now, especially, with the resources that we have, we're simply going to procure the things with the mentality of no limitation to be able to satisfy the limitless hunger of the beings who are appearing. Right? So that's like black hole land, right? That's going to go in those two directions forever. This hunger, this level of specificity of what it is that I must eat, which I understand is very important, sometimes. But oftentimes is not very important. But sometimes is very, very important. That specificity, it just knows no end. And now in this direction, just go to the store. That's a little wild. Whatever fad is happening, whatever this thing, that thing, or whatever, and that goes on forever. So I think you're caught in between those two things. Yeah, so what is the shift to the simple receiving on the end of what do I have to provide for people? It's not a limitless thing. And I'm not saying that you're conceptualizing it as limitless, but you're in a terrain where there's not really a palpable edge to it.
Yeah.
So it manifests itself over here.
Is there a way that shows up in Ananda's story?
Yeah, so they gather together to make these offerings, and they just bring what they have, together. Mm-hmm. The way that shows up in our ritual is that we gather together, make different kinds of offerings. The offerings, for the most part, are uncooked offerings. So the point of that is you give them food, and then in the ritual you ask them to accept the food, but then also prepare the food and for them to make offerings. So there's this kind of like a mirroring that's happening. They're not only receiving offerings, but with what they receive, they prepare food and feed to others. So that kind of mirroring is happening there. But what they receive is what they have to cook. What we're able to give, we have to realize, realizing that line between what's received and what is just moving to get what it is that we want. In its most condensed thing, which you won't see in the ritual because it's something that just the celebrant or the head priest for the ceremony does. There's one point. There's a lot of mumbo jumbo, and that's the technical word of it. But there's one point in which I will take 7 grains of rice, and I place them in my hand, and hold them like this, which has a lot of esoteric meanings. But even without the esoteric meanings, you can just feel what that's like to hold something like this. And this is to reveal the preciousness of that, the true preciousness of 1 grain of rice. And then it gets dropped into the water, which is the disk of water, is one way to understand is the clear mind. So that's the place to look for what it means to satisfy people, not just what is their desire. Because actually fulfilling people's desires does not satisfy them. Long story short. Yeah. So the limitation becomes important. How do we learn to live with that limitation is our challenge.
Uh-huh. Every year, different topics. Having heard the story many times, different facets of it come more forward.
Yeah.
And this time around, it really strikes me that Ananda doesn't do anything except ask for help, and cries, and that in and of itself, like, kind of an amazing quality of something to contemplate deeply.
Yeah.
But then that all the characters, the Buddha, Enku, that they are all in some way asking for help. There's some facet of each of their experiences about asking for help. So Enku can be seen as like representing all the beings asking for his help, and then the Buddha needs the help of Avalokiteshvara. It's not something he invents on his own. There's all of these kinds of connections of help, and even in the way that we then ask the spirits to help us. Can you talk about the importance of that, like really the basic way in which asking for help is part of this?
Well, I mean, I don't think I have much to add, Chuck. I think you just nailed it. I mean, that's and how hard is that? Why is that so hard? To actually like face our own limitation and then to entrust that to another, to something that we trust. And if we're the Buddha's attendant, maybe that would be really clear, where to go. And for us, maybe that part is could be a little complex. But I'm curious if there's anything in your life, in the sense of, like, you've talked about it very beautifully in a mythological way. I'm curious if there's anything in your life where you have felt that kind of like, I see things in a different way. Like the dream, the purple hat, it's like there's something that, I'm not saying it has to be a dream or a vision or anything like that, but a place where there's this marked shift in the way that you're seeing things in regard to that kind of asking for help.
I mean, all kinds of places, but the thing that comes up right now is just, in my work life, so much of it is impossible without lots of help. And sometimes I don't acknowledge that. I just sort of pretend that things are happening because they're supposed to happen, or I get to the office and something gets ready for me, and I don't really think about all of the other lives that are necessary to make what I think I'm doing possible. And if you just take away a few of the buttresses holding the whole thing up, it's just catastrophe. And I suppose we all have different formations of that, and whatever it is we do with our time in the world, but how that's also reflected in, I don't know, like, I think I'm gonna go make lunch, and just like, so much help is needed for that infrastructure to, so, I mean, that's a very direct.
Wonderful. I think one place to work on this asking for help business is, don't wait till you think you're in trouble to ask for help. I mean, if you're in trouble, that's a good time to ask for help. So don't not help. Don't not ask for help when you're in trouble. But it's like we wait for that. But there's this other thing that you can do, and I think you're pointing to that you can wake up to all the help you're receiving all the time to begin with. And as you start to recognize this, it's much easier actually to ask people for help, because you realize you're being helped all the time. And that's something that, as individuals, we should endeavor to do that within our community here at Budai Temple, within your various communities or families, etc., to cultivate that place where appreciation is kind of the flip side of asking for help. It's like the part where we recognize that we are being helped. And then as we start to acknowledge that, then when we get to the place where, oh, maybe I need some help, it's not so hard. It's not so hard to ask for it. Okay. So next week, please come if you're able to. And then just also know, if you can make a little extra time to stay afterwards, we always have lunch together afterwards, and there'll be, we always make Indian food. We usually have dal and some sometimes chapati, rice, different kinds of pickles and things to put on it, and we accommodate a very wide variety of ways that you might need to be able to eat, but I will guarantee you will be nourished.